Thank you for that welcome, and it's customary in Australia, I would also like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land we gather on, the First Nations people, and pay my respect to their elders past and present, and also Air Français.
Je reconnais les peuples des Premières Nations sur les terres traditionnelles desquelles nous nous réunissons, et je rends hommage à leurs doyens d'hier et d'aujourd'hui.
I was meant to learn that, but I didn't, so I thought I'd play it instead. A friend of mine did that for me. Thanks for the welcome. So as Kathleen said, I'm basically somehow in 15 minutes going to try to give you a very quick overview of the history of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander participation in the Second World War. And there's a lot to get through, so I'm going to talk fast and dive right into it. But I actually want to first start with a story. It was the 19th of February, 1942. That was the first major Japanese raid that bombed and destroyed the city of Darwin on the north coast of Australia. And just after this raid, a Japanese plane crashed on one of the Tiwi Islands, which are just off the coast of Darwin. And the Japanese pilot survives, he gets out, and he comes across a group of Aboriginal women who are sitting there with a baby. And the Aboriginal women, they get up and they run away, and the Japanese pilot, he picks up this baby, and he's holding it, and meanwhile an Aboriginal man named Matthias Ulungura sneaks up behind him, holds a tomahawk to his back and says, "Stick 'em up." And this is the story of the first ever Japanese prisoner of war who was captured on Australian soil. And it's a really important story, I think, in Australia's war history. Very few Australians know this story. Indigenous communities know this story. Over the years, I usually ask for a show of hands, has anyone heard this before? The only time I ever saw a bunch of hands go up was when I presented to an Indigenous audience. And so I think in many ways this shows how important the war is to Indigenous history, how important Indigenous people are to the war history, but also how, I would say, similar to Canada, often that history has been overlooked. So one thing that Scott mentioned this morning, and I'm a strong believer in this, is you can't examine the war history in a vacuum. We need to understand what's going on politically, socially, economically for Indigenous people at the time. I'm not going to explain all of these things because I don't have time, but this is basically the context of the 1930s for Indigenous people, broadly speaking, in Australia. And the big context is they are under very significant state control, and assimilation policies are being brought in. And there's also the child removal policies had been in place in every state for several decades. This led to what's known in Australia as the stolen generations. It's kind of our version of the residential schools, except I would argue quite worse, to be honest. And child removal is important because some of these soldiers would be people who were themselves removed as children. Also, there are stories that I don't have time to get into of men who went off to war and their children were taken away while they were gone. And when they came back, they couldn't get their children back. So child removal is a very important context. But the 1930s is also the first time that you really see a period of Aboriginal activism in Australia as well. And part of that activism, they do often point to the First World War and say, hey, we fought in the First World War, give us some citizenship rights. And it doesn't happen. But that's the sort of context for Indigenous affairs when the Second World War breaks out in Australia. So when the war breaks out, it's business as usual for the first 2 years in Australia. And during this period, the question does come up, should we allow Aboriginal people to enlist? What's the rule on this? There are some mentions in the Defence Act about being liable for compulsory call-up, if there ever is call-up, and they say that people of not substantial European origin or descent will not be liable for call-up. But what about volunteering? So if they were conscription, they wouldn't be liable. What about volunteering? Well, in 1940, the federal government comes out and they explicitly prohibit non-white people from entering the Army and the Navy. The quote is, "The admission of aliens or British subjects of non-European origin or descent to the Australian Defence Forces is undesirable in principle, but that a departure from this principle is justified in order to provide for the special needs of any of the services during the war." And that "but" will become important, as I'll get to in a moment. The Air Force, this didn't apply to the Air Force, but because of the specialization and the technical skills required for the Air Force, very small number of Aboriginal people wound up in the men's Air Force. There were a few women in the women's Air Force. During the early period of the war, when it's just in Europe, there's about 300 to 400 Aboriginal people who managed to enlist. The way that this 400 or so managed to enlist is because it says non-European origin or descent, but what the heck does that mean? And at the time, every state and territory in Australia had a different law defining who was and who wasn't Aboriginal. We didn't have one Indian Act to cover the whole country. Every state had their own laws. And because of this, in some states you might be considered European, in some states you might be considered Aboriginal, and others you might be so-called half-caste, but that's a very offensive term that we don't use anymore. And this is one document a public servant wrote in 1941 that was trying to clarify the situation. And I won't read it out, you can read it, but it's very confusing. And I think the confusingness of that quote speaks to the confusingness of the policy. So in the first few years of the war, to enlist as an Aboriginal person, you basically either had to pretend you weren't Aboriginal, that you were European, or let the authorities assume that was the case. But of course, then Pearl Harbor happens, and the Japanese advance happens, and the war is now on Australia's doorstep. So after Pearl Harbor, Australia needs all the manpower and all the women power that Australia can get. That but comes into play. They basically, the rule's never overturned, it's just ignored, essentially. By the end of the war, there's about 4,000 Aboriginal people and about 850 Torres Strait Islanders who serve. And we can only estimate because they didn't record race on the enlistment forms. So why did these people enlist? And I think Scott touched on some of this morning, so I don't need to go into great detail, but when you look at the oral and written testimonies, things that come up, patriotism, defending their own country, economic motivations, being some of the most disadvantaged people in Australia. This is now, if you can join up, that's a steady wage, that's an employment. Adventure does come up, some family traditions from the First World War. Often what's said in retrospect, and this is a point that I and a few other historians are trying to tease out, there's the argument that they say they would join up hoping they could get civil rights, equal rights after the war. But often that's said sort of after the war in retrospect. In the documents at the time, there's less of this, we want to join up for civil rights. Although a few organizations do pose that issue. Reg Saunders, who was the first Aboriginal officer in the army during the war, he's probably the most famous Aboriginal person who served. He said, "I suppose I decided to join because of the family. My dad was a soldier, and all my uncles and various cousins were soldiers, servicemen, including my grandfather. And also there was the fact that there was a war going on. My dad felt there was a responsibility." A Torres Strait Islander named Charles Mean, he said, "I liked to enlist because some of the boys I know, they enlisted, and I thought, well, I may as well be in it too." And there were, of course, also people who tried to enlist but were turned away because they were not European. One letter of complaint to the Prime Minister in 1942 said, "I was told we have received orders that no more Aboriginals should be taken in any part of the Australian Army. We dark men are now blackballed right throughout the Commonwealth. So much for that lot." So for the integrated soldiers, there's this, we're trying to keep you out policy. But once you're in, and generally most of the reports are that it was quite an equal experience. And that's because there were not segregated units like there were in the United States segregating black from white, because theoretically everyone was white. If you were one of these non-whites who got in, you were treated as an equal. And a lot of that had to do with the military training, the breaking the people down and creating you as a coherent unit. A lot of it had to do with, especially in combat, there's no room for racism. So for these reasons, most of the people who served do report it was quite an egalitarian experience, and many of them say it was the first time in their lives that they were treated as equals. And that's a very eye-opening, important experience for them. A quote from Bill Egan, "I don't think being an Aborigine in the Army made any difference. We got on pretty well, we were treated pretty much the same." And also they received the same pay, and that is a very big change for most of these men and women as well. It's not to say racism never happened, but usually in the stories, the racism is the exception, it's not the norm. And again, as the war goes on and they build these bonds of brotherhood and sisterhood, the bonds become stronger than any racial prejudice. And this is just a great cartoon from the period. So there's another dimension to the story in Australia, though, besides the integrated soldier, and that's because after Pearl Harbor, the north coast of Australia is a front line in the war. And we know now that Japan did not actually plan on invading Australia, but at the time people really genuinely feared that Japan was going to invade. Darwin was bombed, first on the 19th of February, and then they suffered quite a few other raids. And very quickly, the authorities realized at the very least they need to make sure that the Aboriginal populations of the North don't support the Japanese, and there were genuine fears that they would support the Japanese, though these fears never, ever, ever came to fruition. So at the very least, they wanted to make sure they stayed loyal to Australia, but what would be even better would be to get the Aboriginal populations of the North on board working with the military. One of the ways they do this is there's a series of labor camps that are set up across the Northern Territory of Australia in 1942. What these do is they bring in the men and women who tend to be people who were working on the cattle stations, who were in, I would suppose you might say, semi-settled areas, not necessarily living in townships, but were people who had had contact with settler society. They were not people living in remote, generally isolated areas. These camps are very interesting. Some anthropologists did some work on them in the 1980s and have published some of the best work on them because they actually are a place where Aboriginal people are paid more than they were previously. There's more order and structure, but in a good way. There's a sense of hygiene. They have better housing, better living conditions. But it's still not equal to what the army soldiers are receiving, who they are actually supporting. Often the men are doing manual labor, like helping move munitions, loading and unloading trains and other stuff. The women are working in the camps as well. They're doing the cooking, they're doing the cleaning, salting hides of some of the cattle that they're dealing with. And it's in the documents that when there's talk of should we pay them equally, the documents actually say no. You can't pay these people equally because then they're going to want to be paid equally after the war. So there is a tension at play there, and there are some military officials who are sort of sympathetic to the Aboriginal people's condition, but at the same time say this will piss off the pastoralists and we can't do that. So it's an interesting historical positioning, the camps, that I'm just going to leave there for time interest. There's quite a lot of patrols on the north. The population at the time, I didn't get into this, but the north of Australia, the reason this is so important is like there are very few settlers living in the north at this time. The vast majority of the population is Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander, and the vast majority of them are still living in remote areas where they may have only had contact with police from time to time or missionaries. And in a lot of these incredibly remote areas, you do have groups that go on patrols, that they might patrol for the local missionary, or sometimes the Army or the Air Force come and set up patrols with the people. You have cases like that Tiwi Island one I mentioned at the beginning, where they actually captured a Japanese crashed pilot. There are cases of them rescuing crashed Australian or crashed American pilots. This is one of the more famous cases. I won't read the quote out, but I'll tell the story briefly. It's an American pilot who crashes in the Gulf of Carpentaria. He drifts ashore and he's unconscious, and a group of Aboriginal men come upon him. And at first they just see this unconscious person. They don't know if he's a friend, they don't know if he's a foe, they don't know if he's Japanese. And then they see the crucifix around his neck, and they realize that he's a friend. So they take him and they carry him to the local mission. And this quote from one of the men who was involved in that rescue, it's interesting, is that the man who's being rescued is afraid that they're cannibals. He's calling them black bastards. So as he's being rescued, he's still terrified of these people. And that comes up in at least one or two other rescue stories. Not quite as brutally, but there's at least one other rescue story that a white man tells, and he's very honest. He said, we thought they might be cannibals. We had been told that they were cannibals in this area, which they weren't. So that's going on the north coast. Now, there are a few more formal patrols. So those are some of the informal ones. There's one sort of formal unit that is formed in a region of the Northern Territory called Arnhem Land, which is to the east of Darwin. And it's formed in 1941 called the Northern Territory Special Reconnaissance Unit. It's organized by an anthropologist who had worked in that area in the 1930s. And then when the war breaks out, he enlists and he's serving. And he inspires a colonel in the army who then comes back to him and tells him, if the Japanese were to land, this place is completely undefended. And this anthropologist says, the Aboriginal people who know this area, they live in this area, they could be organized into a patrol group, and they could be used to engage in a guerrilla warfare in case the Japanese ever landed. So this group was formed the planning for it began in mid-1941, so even before Pearl Harbor. The group forms in February 1942. It's a nucleus of 51 Yolngu men, organized by Donald Thompson, and he doesn't give them guns. He trains them to use their traditional bush tactics, using spears and whatnot, to fight a guerrilla war if Japan ever were to invade. which fortunately doesn't happen. He does train them to avoid machine gun fire, and their payment is fish hooks, wire, tobacco. It's not until 1992 that they're awarded back pay. The group is disbanded in 1943 for various reasons, but one of the main reasons is the war has moved on, and there's a brand new patrol force that's sort of taken over the top of Australia that's run by white people, but still with Aboriginal people doing most of the tracking. The other place where you get a separate unit is in the Torres Strait. So the Torres Strait is this tiny little bit of water that separates Australia from Papua New Guinea. There's about 274 islands in the Torres Strait, and the Torres Strait Islanders, they are a different indigenous culture people to Aboriginal people. That's why we say Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander in Australia. And so Torres Strait being on a sort of shipping lane, and after Japan comes into the war, Japan gets very close to taking Papua New Guinea. They know that Torres Strait is also a front line in the war. And they actually start planning the defense of what's called the Torres Strait Light Infantry Battalion, again, before Pearl Harbor. They start planning this a few months beforehand. And if you go to the Torres Strait, or if you go to Cairns, where there's a large Torres Strait population, almost everyone's grandfather served in the Torres Strait Light Infantry Battalion. It was almost every able-bodied male in the Torres Strait was serving in this or in some other capacity during the war. Technically, they were volunteers. There are some suggestions in the oral testimonies that there was a bit of coercion for some of these men. Tom Loa says, but the recruiters rounded up some of our boys with fixed bayonets, and they got nearly everyone there in that recruiting drive. They seemed to scare people, and that made me I don't believe in this. If they come in polite manner or something to ask for recruits, that would be different. But with fixed bayonets? So the Torres Strait group, they are regularly enlisted, but they are still receiving less pay than the white men and the Malaysian men that they are serving alongside. They actually go on strike at one stage over the unequal pay issue in January 1944, but they're not awarded back pay until 1982 for the men who serve in the Torres Strait Light Infantry Battalion. Now, I am also a historian of gender and sexuality, so I absolutely think it's important we talk about women in the war. Most of women's stories would be on Homefront, which would be a different paper, but there are women who enlist in the women's services. It's not that many. I would probably guesstimate 75 maximum in Australia, to be honest. Udjaru Nunakal is the most famous because after the war she goes on to become an activist and then a poet. And she talks about why she joined the army, the women's army service. She said, I had been working as a domestic for 2 shillings and 6 pence a week before I joined the army. You see, Aboriginals weren't entitled to any extra concessions of learning, and it was the army who changed the whole thing around. They said, if you join the army, you are going to go into the dimwits course and you can learn. And as soon as I got out of the army, of course I went into the dimwits course and did a stenographer's course, shorthand, typing, and bookkeeping. And she also has a great quote, I didn't write it down, where she says, back then if you were Aboriginal and you wanted to get an education, there were 2 places you could go, prison or the army, and prison didn't appeal to me, is another quote of hers. And for the few women who do enlist, it is quite interesting in that for Aboriginal women, basically domestic service was the only employment you could have at the time. This is an escape from domestic service, and it brings them into education opportunities that were very white middle-class women, but for them, that is quite a leg up to what they were able to have otherwise. So it is quite an empowering experience for Aboriginal women. They do have a lot of similar motivations to the men that I mentioned earlier to join. I would say women in remote areas were going along with the patrols with their men. Women were in those labor camps I mentioned. And there's also stories of upheaval for women, or women who have to take care of in the remote areas. In Torres Strait, for instance, there's a whole book on Torres Strait Islander women in the war and the effects when the men go off to war. There's also, when the Americans come to town, stories of encounters with the Americans. There's a rise of venereal disease in parts of North Queensland, and at first they blame the women, and then when the missionaries say, why are you blaming the women? They blame the black Americans, as they apparently were responsible for it, and not the white men. Okay, so just to sort of try and wrap it up, when the war is over, I will just basically defer to what Scott said this morning. It's basically back to the status quo of inequality. Assimilation policy comes even greater. Aboriginal contributions to the war are forgotten. A quote from a Yolngu man involved in the war: "I didn't come out with no bars on my shoulder, no ribbons on my chest, no money in my pocket, no deserved pay, no land to go back to and say, this is my land." This is a poem written by an Aboriginal veteran of the Korean War named Sess Fisher. "Granny was treated like a Queen Anzac Day." See, that's Australia's big Memorial Day. "See the shiny medals flashing from far away. Next day they crossed the street, racism was back, didn't treat her equal just because she was black." And finally, I would just say World War II was just a blip on the military radar. Indigenous people have continued to serve in the defense forces and still do today. A lot of what we heard from the general this morning, those sorts of programs he was talking about, there are very similar programs in Australia as well, though with some differentiations. And actually my research more recently hasn't been on World War II, it's actually been on the post-war stuff, but I was asked to talk about World War II today, so I'll just leave it with that slide. So, thank you.